are really refreshing. So our next speaker is Anna Khakee, correct? Yeah? She is from Malta and educated as well in Lund, Sweden. So we have a Swedish invasion here. Hopefully we break it on Sunday in the championship. Please go ahead. The topic is absolutely in line with hunting.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. A special thanks to Jeff, who maintained his invitation to me, although I said that I wouldn't be able to prepare a fully fledged paper for this conference. So what I'm putting to you is also something where I would very much like your input on how to take the empirical side of the research forward. I should also say that I'm coming from another perspective onto this civilizational debate, because most of my research has really been conducted on democracy promotion. And as I'll explain in a couple of minutes, that literature has been quite ahistorical and not very much anchored into an understanding of civilizations. So my research into civilizations, as you will note, is of quite recent standing, so I would love to get your input on that as well. So I'm moving away from a historical time and from a very exciting topic to a very dry topic, which is the European Union, and that normally puts people to sleep quite immediately. I'm aiming to look at how, in its democracy promotion, because the EU is one of the largest democracy promoter actors globally since the end of the Cold War, and how, and I'm going to use discourse analysis, so a more constructivist approach, how the European Union is construing conceptions of European civilization and European history as part of their democracy promotion practice. So the background to this question, which I will elaborate on a little bit later on, is to look at the depiction in this context also of colonialism as part of European civilization, actually. Because if we look at colonialism, we see that it's part and parcel of European history and its encounters with others. However, colonialism has been very much of a blind spot in the histories of the European Union. So it's in the last 15 or so years that historiographers have started to look at the role of colonialism in the European project. Normally, the way that the European project is depicted is as a counterbalance to European history, but European history in a very particular sense. So European history in terms of overcoming the barbarism of the Second World War. So overcoming the way that the Europeans unleashed horror across the globe throughout the Second World War, but also obviously in the context of the Holocaust and the genocide against the Jews, the Romans, and other undesirable populations. So when you look at European history, and more scholars are doing this, although it remains rather limited, it has been as a kind of construction of something in opposition and having learned from that history. What is absent from that, and something that has been criticized in the last decade and a half or so, has been the barbarism of colonialism and the presence of colonialism in the European Union history. So what we're seeing is that although when the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957, 4 of the member state, of the founding member states, of 4 out of 6, were at the time colonial powers. 5 out of 6 had been so in living memory. And they were involved to various degrees and in various times in violent conflict against different liberation movements in the colonized world. This is not, and this is something that post-colonial writers have been discussing or starting to discuss, this is not part of how the European project is portrayed normally. And this is P.O. Hansen, another Swede, so I'm trying to continue the Swedish connection here, talks a lot about how Algeria was actually part of the European Union, because Algeria was obviously part and parcel of France, considered as an integral part of France, until the very, very brutal and violent conflict that led to decolonization. And this is something which is also not discussed in discussing European history. So my goal here is to sort of feed into this literature on the history of the European Union and how it portrays its own history, but looking less at what has been normally discussed up until today, which is European writings about European history generally, and the internal identity construction of the EU, or its current relationship towards the remains of the colonial empires, because obviously there are remains of the colonial empires still existing today in the extra-European territories, which are also formally part of the EU. I'm also not looking at whether the EU is now and today a kind of different type of empire or constructing a new type of empire. I know some of my colleagues here today have discussed that. But what I'm looking at is, or what I'm aiming to look at is how the European Union in its external policies, and in particular in its external policies aiming to promote what it sees as its core values, so peace, democracy, and human rights, how that is anchored in history and an understanding of European history. So that's where I'm coming from. There's obviously a vast literature already on democracy promotion as well by the European Union. Obviously, the US is also an important actor in this regard. Often in this literature, there's several main strands of this literature. One is to look at what is in this literature seen as the main successes of democracy promotion at the European level, and that is looking at the intra-European successes, so looking at how, using conditionality, the European Union managed to anchor Greek democracy, Portuguese, Spanish democracy, and after the end of the Cold War, through the so-called Copenhagen criteria, anchor the former Central and European Warsaw Pact states into the democratic European Union. Some have criticized that from a post-colonial perspective, in fact, but that is something which the democracy promotion literature does not take into account. So these are two literatures that actually don't speak to each other. There is also another literature which looks at the much less successful, from the point of view of democracy promotion, literature, attempts by the European Union to promote democracy beyond the classical borders of Europe. So looking at how the European Union is trying to various degrees to promote its core values in the Mediterranean and through the neighborhood policy, and also in the ACP states, so in the former colonies in Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific. And here the conclusion are very, again, very technical in looking at to what extent conditionalities, positive and negative, have been applied, to what extent they have been successful, etc. So this literature, in contrast to that one on post-colonialism, tends to be much more policy-oriented, very ahistorical, very much looking at what has happened since the end of the Cold War, but not looking back in history at where this program of democracy promotion might be rooted. And it is very much oriented at, okay, where are policymakers going right? Where are they going wrong? How is this agenda linked or in contradiction to security agendas, economic agendas, etc.? So that's just to situate what I aim to do within these two bodies of literature. So I'm proposing to use a discursive type of analysis, so using a social constructivist approach to looking at European conceptions of its own history when promoting democracy and human rights in the former colonies. From a post-colonial perspective, that is quite a normal thing to do. Post-colonialism has drawn a lot on discourse analysis, because just as discourse analysis is obviously about the social construction of the social world and about the implications of these constructions and of the dominant discourses and the difficulties of other discourses of making themselves heard, how that implies and has an implication for policy and practice, so does post-colonial thinking in large part, because obviously here again we're talking about how the dominant discourses of the colonial powers have made it difficult for discordant voices from the colonies to make themselves heard and create a counter narrative to those that are in vogue and power. This type of discursive analysis has been used a lot less when we look at the democracy promotion literature. So it's not something which is as commonly used. There are a couple of exceptions. Khakee and others have used a more discursive approach to looking at what types of democracy are promoted by the European Union and European actors, but it's not something that has been used as much. Coming to the research design, so in a way this is where I am at for the moment, and what I don't have yet is the empirical part of the research. Obviously there's a potentially very vast amount of texts produced by the European Union that could be relevant to this kind of a discursive analysis. So I've had to narrow down and try to vet down what kinds of texts I'm going to look at, and what I'm thinking of doing in the coming months, because I'm intent on keeping my deadlines that I promised to Jeff, is a four-pronged approach. So the first one would be to look at general programmatic texts by the European Union when it comes to democracy promotion, human rights promotion. So those big policy outlines that come ever so often and are produced by the European Union. So that's one of the four types of texts that I wanted to look at. Then I wanted to look at key texts that are related to democracy, peace, and human rights and their promotion in 5 particular post-colonial states, so 5 former colonies of European states, which have been particularly problematic because of the colonial history. So one is Algeria, obviously a former French colony, and with a very, very brutal colonization and decolonization process. The second one, Congo. Again, this is a former Belgian colony, obviously, and very brutal, so brutal that it was already at the turn of the 20th century seen as a case of extreme brutality by the King Leopold, who had it as his private possession at the time. So the second one is Drc Congo. The third one, Kenya, UK colony, and it's normally listed among when the British colonial misdeeds are portrayed. The ones against the Mau Mau in Kenya are normally listed as some of the worst crimes committed by the UK as a colonial power. Then Libya, Italian former colony, and one of the few cases where there's quite wide agreement that what the Italians did in the beginning of the 20th century was tantamount to genocide versus the Libyan population. And then fifth, Namibia, where actually, so a former German colony, and actually recognized by the German government as constituting genocide against the Herero and the Namakwa ethnic groups in Namibia. So I tried to select a variety of colonies. All of them are African, but of different colonial powers, so covering all except the Netherlands. And looking again at key speeches related to the democracy agenda vis-à-vis those countries. Then the third part of the empirical research would be to look at key speeches related to international humanitarian law. So the laws of war, and so laws of war war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and looking at how that's portrayed in the European discourse. And obviously that is because all of these crimes were also committed during colonial times by the colonial powers. And then the first part would be to look at key speeches at key historical junctures when there was a potential democratic opening in a former colony. So I thought of looking at obviously the end of apartheid as a key moment of democratic change in a former colony. Also looking at the Arab Spring as a second case of a potential democratic opening, and most recently the fall of Mugabe in Zimbabwe as another potential case. So I have quite a lot of empirical research to undertake still for this project, and that's where I am at for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think this is a huge project. Don't become a prisoner of European Union speech.
I will, it seems.
Yeah, because they're always giving us the impression of a shining city on a golden hill. And then the reality is a little bit different. And especially if you look at, for example, at the question of democracy projection and promotion. I mean, the European Union was very, very important even in the 90s. But nowadays, if you look at areas, even in Africa and the East and so forth, they are competitors. And the European Union attraction has suffered a lot. That's one point. The second point, which I would like to make, because I'm a child of the 60s, we have had in our national structures very, very deep-going discussions about colonialism. For example, the German left or the French left. I mean, especially in France and Algeria was one of the topics of 68 and the 70s, and as well as in Germany here. And of course, the European Union as such as an institution was not a colonial power. So the discussion was done within the member states. And I think this would be very interesting to distinguish a little bit as well in the forthcoming of your studies.